Nobody is self-sufficient. Nobody is self-made. Nobody does it by themselves. Not even me. At the age of 15, I started talks with my school's guidance counselor, a wonderful and sensitive man. When I hit the age of 16, I was legally emancipated with his help. My abusive parents tried their hardest to keep me under their thumb, and I think they were shocked that I was secretly being proactive. I knew any promises of change were meaningless, and that any apologies were temporary. If it wasn't for Mr. Summers, I wouldn't have had the balls to leave. But he had a plan for me. Mr. Summers' sons and some of his friends were rooming together for college in a little old house, splitting rent. So I'd be living with 3 college-age guys for only $100 a month. I know they each paid more, but they took pity on me. This house wasn't always like this. That's stupid to say, you can deduce that. But even in this state, it feels like more of a home than anything did before the age of 16. Jeff, Mr. Summers' son, as well as Frankie and Craig were like big brothers at first. That's what I thought. I thought they were just slightly more mature than me. I did my own laundry, cooked for myself most of the time. I had a job at the gas station nearby that I walked to since I didn't have my license yet. Hell, Frankie didn't even have a job, but I did. Plus, I dropped out, but they were all still students. I was as tall as Jeff and taller than Craig. I even drank black coffee, integral to the college students' diet. I thought I was an adult. But a few months into adulthood, nights took on a new light for me. It was a rather sudden turn that deflated my ego. I never used to get nightmares. I yearned for dreams. Now dreams reminded me of what I escaped from. The night I got that first nightmare, I ran through the house still asleep, and when Jeff tried to stop me, I threw a glass real hard at his head. He managed to restrain my wrist and at the same time hug me until I woke up. When I realized what was going on, I apologized and said I'd pay for the stitches and be his personal slave, but he laughed. As did the others when they came out to see what the commotion was all about. Despite the considerable scar and the broken glass, they didn't blame me. Craig cleaned up the glass shards while Jeff escorted me back to my bed. Work the next day was terrible. I felt like I wasn't able to do my job, like I wasn't ready. Talking to customers was awful. I must have really been projecting a sense of dread and lack of confidence because half the customers either told me to cheer up or asked if I was okay. I felt like I was a burden to my coworkers. In retrospect, I don't think they knew anything was wrong, at least not at first. On my way home, I passed by my neighbor working on her flower garden. Garden tending always seemed unnecessary to me, like work after work. When I walked through the door to my new home, all 3 of my roommates, as well as Craig's girlfriend at the time, were looking right at me, smiling. They had brought home a dozen glazed donuts just for me, and rented my favorite movie at the time, The Matrix. I love glazed donuts. I felt a kind of dread and embarrassment at being put on the spot. Like when people sing happy birthday to you, it's like there's too much attention and care and concern for you. They were obviously trying to cheer me up, but inside I felt like more of a burden. Next to the kitchen counter where the donuts were was a waste bin, filled with broken glass. It was reminiscent of a shitty diaper to me. I filled that pit in my stomach with thousands of calories of donuts. The silent dark living room also calmed me down. The Matrix got eyes off me. That night, I had a night terror again, but fortunately, I stayed in bed. When Jeff woke me up to calm me down, that image of Neo's mouth disappearing was in my head. I'm not sure if that's what I dreamt or if it just popped in my head right then and there. Regardless, I steered clear of that movie for a good while. I continued to have night terrors with increasing regularity. It wasn't so bad when I stayed in bed, but when I ran through the house asleep, being woken up was as embarrassing as wetting the bed. So extend that feeling throughout the day. It was like going to work and thinking everyone knew you were damaged. There was this aspect of me that I clearly didn't have control over, despite the fact that everyone else my age did. What made things worse were any girls or women that I'd run into would look at me like I was a creep, be they customer or coworker. At the same time, I should have known people didn't know about my problems, because if they did, at least women wouldn't have looked at me like a monster. I imagine that's a hard feeling for younger women to understand. There was a week that went by without any nightmares, at least no nightmares that I remembered or that woke up my roommates. But something woke me up one night. One of my roommates yelled "fuck" in a very agonized voice. It freaked me out. Yelling tended to make me stay put, but Jeff came to check on me, only to see I was fine, if not a little petrified in place. Jeff thought the scream was me, but we came to find out it was Frankie. Frankie was in the kitchen beside the restroom, on the ground, with a piece of glass in his foot. Around him was a considerable amount of clear glass fragments. The cut was rather large and deep, so Jeff, being the most responsible of us, drove Frankie to the ER after managing to help Frankie balance on one foot long enough to piss, which was why he was up in the first place. I offered to help, but Craig cleaned up and said it was fine. As he cleaned, he asked if I remembered breaking glass. I told him I had been sleeping fine and that I hadn't even left my bed at night recently. He said it was fine if I broke the glass, just to make sure to tell someone if it happened and I remembered. I didn't like that it was being assumed that I broke the glass, but I knew that that's where the evidence pointed. Craig made sure to tell me that regardless of what happened, it wasn't my fault. I was concerned about the glass, however. The glasses we had some sort of design on them. I didn't remember any of them being completely clear. I was concentrating on the blood at the time, so I didn't think anything was off until I thought back on it at the gas station the next day. Later that same day, Mr. Summers stopped by the house and asked me some questions. There was a battery of questions, most of them you can guess if you've been to a therapist before. That discussion with him must have been when I realized I wasn't feeling like an adult, because the next day, Jeff brought home a booklet that you study to get your driver's permit. 3 nights a week, the guys agreed to have a silent house, which was when I'd normally go read one of Frankie's fantasy novels for 4 hours. But now, I had something to study with them. I too was able to sternly and angrily look into a book by force, and I rested easier because of it. Sometime during that week, there was a loud yelling coming from the next door neighbor's house. There was an adult yelling, and the 2 little girls that always play in the front yard were screaming. Jeff came in to comfort me, knowing I'd be more than a little freaked out. He called 911 even though he didn't think it was anything to be too worried about. Mr. Summers' attitude of intervening was clearly passed down to his son. Moments later, the ambulance arrived and the single mother and her 2 children were driven to the hospital. Work was getting better despite the residual, imaginary stink of shame I felt. Things were turning around and the regulars could tell. They started chatting with me more, getting to know me. But as you might have guessed, something had to go wrong sooner or later. I was working with Janet on the late shift. Well, late shift for me, it was around 10 o'clock. Janet was somewhere in her 30s and, like me, didn't often talk at work. She just sort of silently judged me. I know that she thought I was dumb for sure. Other co-workers had told me as much. She went into the back to stock cold products and she came out with a look on her face. I'll avoid describing it, just know that it was a look. As it turns out, there was broken glass on the floor in the back. She showed me the glass and assumed I broke it and did nothing. I must have looked rather guilty. I felt guilty despite rationally knowing I had nothing to do with it. What perplexed us both was the lack of frozen drink on the floor, as you'd expect behind the cooler section. Neither of us could place what bottle was broken either. For a while, I had night terrors off and on, and although I hid it from my roommates, I actively avoided sleeping. So sleepy one morning, I was on my way to work, a little delirious, and I decided to stop and smell the roses, as the saying goes. I knelt down to see my neighbor's garden, and littered in the bed of dirt were small, clear, irregular-shaped pieces of glass. My face reddened, and I tried to nonchalantly walk away. I couldn't help but feel connected any time I was around glass. At work, I began stacking glass bottles with both hands, tightly gripping them and using all of my concentration on them. It slowed down my work. On the way home, I was so tired that I rested at a playground picnic area. I didn't mean to fall asleep. You know how it is. When you're tired, you convince yourself that you're just resting your eyes. It couldn't have taken more than a minute from the time I put my head on my arms on the table for me to pass out. I drifted off to sleep. It was like a kick to the side of the head. In my sleep, I felt something. Not physically, just like a presence. It didn't terrify me. It wasn't like a nightmare. It wasn't much like a dream either. Think of it as falling asleep on a car ride with someone else driving. Sometimes you can feel yourself moving about the world while not awake, while not responsible or thinking. You're just on a trip. Maybe that's not right. It felt like something approached me. I didn't hear anything, at least not in terms of movement. But when it was close, what I did make out was a quick inhale of air from very big, powerful lungs, and perhaps a very small mouth. I felt the breaths before I heard them. Like, with each gasp, and there were several, there was an increased smell of sand. Not like being at the beach, but like being at a wet playground where there's a sand pit. Then I felt a sensation I've rarely felt then. It was like an itch, but inside my upper back. Try as I might, in my sleep my body wouldn't move my improvised pillows to scratch it. I then heard something that I believe woke me up, yet I was unwilling to move. It was a sort of vibrating sound, but muffled by a particularly thick piece of fabric, like canvas or leather. Then there was a sound that rapidly surrounded me, like I was surrounded by an ice machine, plopping bits of crushed ice around me. I felt a tapping on my shoulder, and I almost decked the person who woke me. As it turns out, it was just a man in overalls, concerned for me. Concerned about the glass fragments surrounding me. On the table, the seat, around my feet. I was flanked on all sides by little bits of pristine glass. Not a single piece touched me. This man asked me about the glass, but I can't recall how he phrased the question. I just carefully got up and jetted home. It was darker than before, and I didn't have a watch. Jeff and the guys were relieved when I was home. Jeff wanted to talk because he said I looked worried. I told him that it could wait until the morning. But even then, I didn't know what I was going to tell him. The next morning was Saturday, which I had off. I was up early due to my disturbing nap. Still, I was exhausted from my lack of sleep. Jeff met me at the breakfast table. I didn't think he'd be up yet, and I was watching Magical School Bus. I made it clear I was watching it since it was the only thing on. Jeff softly demanded that I tell him what happened last night. I did. I don't know if Jeff believed me, but there wasn't any judgment. He understood that I felt that that's what happened. I politely asked him not to tell the others. he agreed to only tell Mr. Summers. Mr. Summers arrived later to pick me up that day. I was moping around my room when he took me to get a cell phone, a nice one with a camera and everything. This was when that was a new top-of-the-line feature. At the time, I thought he was trying to make me feel more grown-up, more responsible. But in retrospect, I think he was trying to tie me to reality, making sure I could always be contacted for my safety. I was starting to get used to taking help from my new family. It started to feel like an alright thing to do. Just a little. He also got me donuts. Donuts were hard for me to turn down. That night, there was a party with my roommate's college friends. Frankie said when I wasn't crazy anymore, I could drink too if I didn't tell Mr. Summers. He didn't phrase it like that, but I guess that's what he meant. I wasn't offended by that, but I don't think he knew what part alcohol played in my past. Still, since people started showing up and being happy to meet me, I was having a good time. I guess you look pretty independent if you're the only high school-age kid rooming with college students. Well into the night, some girl whose name I can't remember for the life of me threw up on the coffee table, ruining Frank's copy of one of his Wheel of Time books. Everyone laughed about it but me. I felt bad for her. Her puking must have signaled to everyone that the party was over. Some parents showed up to drive home their kids and their kids' friends. The one designated driver had like 6 people pile into his 2-door Honda. All that remained was Puke Girl, who passed out right beside the coffee table. Jeff had to check her pulse. Frankie and I lifted her up and took her to my bed. It was the first time I touched the girl, and how desperately I wished that it was under different circumstances. While still under the same roof, the couch wasn't the same as my bed. Just when my habits were getting formed, I was jettisoned from my place of sleep. I rested so long on the couch that my body from my shoulders down went numb. I couldn't think about anything besides the fact that I wasn't sleeping, or at least I didn't think I was. But when I slowly opened my eyes, while considering whether or not to get up and watch TV, I saw something entering from the kitchen window. A window I thought was closed. I began to wonder if I was asleep, or if the window opening woke me up. It was dark, but there were a few features of the thing I could make out. It was goblin-like, in a way, an almost round body, with 2 incredibly long, lanky legs. It wore black clothes that made it almost as dark as a pure silhouette, but some of its outlining features hinted at shades of objects, such as its clothes which wrapped around its form many times over, and ball-like structures that hung loosely from delicate strings. Its head tucked itself into its collar, and its arms were held up close to its chest like a kangaroo. In a paced manner, it untucked its head and bent its long neck back confidently once inside the house, then reached its heavily sleeved arms out to shut the window. It then extended them at a downward angle. It then vibrated slightly, making the same noises I heard around me in the park. Glass fell from its sleeves onto the kitchen floor. I reached for my phone in my pocket as quietly as I could, but the thing instantly was startled, and it clammed back up, only to lunge itself foot first out the window, breaking the glass. Shaking, I realized my phone was in my room. Not only that, I wouldn't have even had enough time to snap a picture of it. I put my head in my hands, and I waited for Jeff or someone to come check on me after the glass shattered. Yet I remained alone. The booze had done everyone in for the night. Feeling vulnerable, I just stared at the broken window until I ran out of awake juice. When I woke back up, I was in Mr. Summers' car. I asked where we were going. He said Mound City. Then I asked about last night in the window. He said not to think about it right now. Mound City is a ritual site that the Hopewell Native Americans used. Mr. Summers and I took a tour of the place, and he talked about Hopewell culture. He explained the history of what the colonials did to the Native Americans. A whole culture, a whole people, utterly destroyed. I don't remember everything that he said. My perception at the time was rather hazy, but I vividly remember him coming to a big tree, turning to face me, and asking me if I thought he felt responsible for what his people did, our people did, to the Native Americans. I was a little stunned. I felt like I was on trial. He paused with a look of introspection. I didn't know what to say or what he was getting at. I must have taken too long to answer because he said, "I don't feel guilty. I don't feel bad about it. I wish it didn't happen, but I don't feel guilty." "Do you understand?" he asked. I couldn't commit to an answer. I didn't know my opinion. I was never pressed for it. Mr. Summers took me to his house. This was where his private practice was, where he made his real money as a private therapist. It was the evening by then. He took me to his client's room. There was a back deck with a sliding glass door leading to it. He sat me down on the chaise, the lounge chair that therapists always have. It was facing the sliding glass door, giving me a good look outside. He was behind me, and he waited. He didn't start the questioning. He just let the session take its time to start. Then, I finally asked if he was going to start with the questions. He asked if I was ready to accept what happened. That's when a black arm crept over the back deck. That thing was crawling onto the deck on the backdrop of the evening sky. He asked again if I was ready to accept what happened. I asked what he meant by that, as the thing stretched out its legs and tiptoed its way to the glass. "Are you ready to accept that bad things have happened around you? That bad things have happened to you?" I said, of course. I knew that was the case. "But are you ready to accept that they weren't your fault?" "But some of them were my fault." "You know that's not true," he said. The thing backed up in one large step. I could have asked for less things for Christmas. I could have ate less and told my parents I loved them more. "You aren't responsible for them," he said, as the thing started to shake. "You were their child, and they didn't love you the right way." Without thinking, I said, "I'm not responsible for them." I said it, not really thinking about it, not believing or disbelieving it, but then being startled after thinking about it. I wasn't responsible for them. I couldn't discount my own experiences, my burdens. And with undivided attention, the thing lunged at the glass door, breaking it and startling myself and Mr. Summers. But that was it. A pile of broken glass. Nothing made it through the glass door. And I think Mr. Summers knew that something changed then, even if he didn't know what exactly. Maybe he knew I just accepted my needs. He embraced me as I shivered in his arms. At home, I slept like a baby. And that was well over 10 years ago. I still treat Jeff and the guys like brothers, and I've opened up my own store, selling tailored suits. I now employ 5 people and supply my hometown with suits, But I know I couldn't have survived without the people around me. I still can't. Nobody does it by themselves.